You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with Devin, and he considers himself a Left-Nietzschean, and that's why we're going to be talking today about what the left can learn from Nietzsche. The famous philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche has been interpreted in all sort of different ways by various people on all sides of the political spectrum. That's why I'm trying to foster a bit of a discourse between people who have very different views on this matter. Devin Gouret did his PhD involving Nietzsche, and he goes by Left-Nieschean on Twitter. And I might as well start with that, Devin. What is a Left-Nieschean, and why Nietzsche? Why would you be fascinated by Nietzsche? What got you into his work, and what does it mean to be a Left-Nieschean for you?
Yeah, well, let me give a little bit about my background, because I think that might help contextualize what the Left-Nieschean idea, cheeky as it is, kind of means. I started out interested in philosophy in my undergrad, did my undergrad at Oberlin College, and kind of gravitated eventually towards political theory. At the time, I was interested in Nietzsche, really on questions of ethics and morality as they came up in some French Poststructuralist thinkers like Foucault and Deleuze, which are two thinkers who I think are well known for having leveraged Nietzsche's thought for insights for left-wing, political and revolutionary kinds of aims. And as I went to graduate school and got my PhD at Yale, I started to become more interested also in another kind of tradition of Marxist thought and Frankfurt School critical theory, which is drawn upon Nietzsche also in its own way, particularly by way of Weber and ideas of modern disenchantment and instrumental reason as being dangers of a sort of dialectic enlightenment. And during my PhD, I was mostly focused on questions of how we ground kind of the normative claims that critical theory, particularly in the Marxist tradition, makes. What kind of basis in whether it's morality or whether it's a purely materialist theory, what kind of basis do claims for revolution and claims against capitalism stand upon? What justifications do they have? And kind of exploring how these come up, particularly in the tradition of Frankfurt School critical theory. And what really, at the time, I wasn't heavily focused on Nietzsche. I was really focused on a series of other thinkers and that some of brought across those traditions I mentioned. And what really brought me back to Nietzsche was sort of experience halfway through grad school of mental illness, of getting diagnosed with bipolar disorder and having a series of experiences with psychosis. And this ended up being what led me away from academia and sort of finishing my PhD and starting to try to be a freelance writer kind of outside the academic context. But it's also what brought me back to thinking about Nietzsche in a serious way, because Nietzsche, of course, is famously the mad philosopher, or at least the philosopher who succumbed in the final 11 years of his life to psychosis. This has always been some feature of both what makes him a potentially dangerous and questionable thinker, but also a potentially interesting and appealing one. And it also kind of goes to questions in his thought of what in his philosophy represents a rupture with what could be certain repressive functions of reason that emerge in the Enlightenment. And while they open the way for what we see as kind of the emancipatory tradition that goes through Rousseau, Kant, Hegel to Marx, also have their darker side, right? Have the other side of that dialectic, through which they might drive us more and more into forms of meaninglessness, forms of nihilism, an inability to make meaningful moral judgments about the world, and potentially succumbing to kind of technologically controlled civilization. And I sort of came back to Nietzsche exploring kind of the political themes I had been thinking about in grad school, now in relation to how Nietzsche's own experience of madness and sickness related to my own life. So I think that highlights for me one major point about what makes Nietzsche a particularly appealing and interesting thinker, which is that he really grabs people in a personal and direct way. I think most people who have come to Nietzsche have often an experience of reading Nietzsche early in life, and reading Nietzsche oftentimes with terrible interpretations of Nietzsche that people later come to recognize are naive, right? And kind of driven by the by the irrationality of youth. But there's a way in which he grabs you directly in that kind of existential way. And it's an existential pathos that certain traditions of particularly Marxist thinking, particularly if they get very economically determined, are sometimes missing, bridging the gap between the structural and material and the individual and existential, or even the psychological domain. Freud being another thinker that the left often tries to explore those themes through. Nietzsche's a thinker who also does some of the same work, and offers a kind of different variation on those kinds of ideas of how social repression can function as a form of psychic repression, as it were, as Deleuze and Guattari like to put it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think Nietzsche is one of those thinkers that has the curse of being fairly easy to read compared to the likes of Hegel or Kant, but it's also why it's easy to read him when you're young and think you know what he's talking about. When you read him talk about the free spirit and the Übermensch, and you think, that's literally me. So, I mean, I got gravitated to Nietzsche in as early as high school. I think he was probably the first thinker I ever was very struck by. And I was already a leftist back then, definitely not a socialist or communist at that time. However, I think the question people really want to know, right, is there's a reading of Nietzsche that sees him more far right. There's some that try to say that he is actually describing something completely different that doesn't really fit within our traditional way of thinking of the political spectrum. Some will say that he's not really political at all. He's a anti-political thinker, and we should separate his political, what we might project his political views from his philosophy. But some will try to say, oh, he's certainly not a socialist, but maybe if you read Marx, he might have been. I've heard some people make that argument. My impression with him was the first time I read him was that he was a very right-wing thinker. I mean, just the way he talked about classes, order ranks, and higher and lower peoples and all that. But I still thought his ideas were useful. I have my ideas to which ideas I think are useful, but I'm curious first to hear yours. Which ideas of Nietzsche that really first gravitated you on a personal level and a political level? Because of course they're inseparable to some extent.
So I guess I would name a couple of things, in part going back to some of the traditions of thought that I previously mentioned. If you are interested in a tradition of left-wing political thought that's in kind of French poststructuralism through thinkers like Foucault, Deleuze, Derrida, Lyotard, others of that period, that's a tradition of thought that's really impossible without Nietzsche. And some of the critical insights that they take from Nietzsche are used particularly in Deleuze and Guattari's reading, to form what they call a sort of anti-fascist mode of thinking, right? This is to target what they perceive as certain homogenizing tendencies towards identitarian thinking that closes off the relational aspect of life and desire with difference and with others, right? And diagnosing the kind of psychology or psychological pathology that underlies a sort of fascist personality that can't stand or can't tolerate difference, that seeks constantly to dominate something external to itself in order to affirm its own sense of identity, right? And the discussions of moral evaluation, particularly in the genealogy of morals, become very important for Deleuze's reading, and I think also for that general kind of framework of postmodern thought of that period. And what you get is where a new kind of normative language for talking about certain issues that might have previously been left out by a classical classical Marxist left framing, right? So this opens up, for example, a whole series of critiques of a class-centric approach to questions of gender, of race, of sexual identity, gender identity, and certain questions about whether a economically focused language or a strictly materialist language is able to capture these other types of power relationships, right? Or whether it may actually, by taking certain Enlightenment ideal of reason, end up complicit in certain forms of repression, or if we don't like the term repression, as in Deleuze and Guattari, certain forms of kind of power knowledge in Foucault, let's say. Through the construction of modern ideas of madness, of sexuality, of criminal guilt, that kind of constitute the modern sex subject. These are kind of distinctively modern forms of repression, arguably, that correspond to the Enlightenment ideal that kind of undergirds the emancipatory tradition in Marx, as I said, sort of their dark underside. This is a theme that really comes out in kind of a lot of critical theory.
Adorno's dialectic of the Enlightenment, for those who don't know what he's referring to.
And whether they're in, they draw on Nietzsche to some extent in dialectic of enlightenment, but a lot of it is already implicit, I think, in the use of Weber, particularly with the theme of the disenchantment of modernity. And this is another kind of consideration that comes up in that tradition of critical theory, whether, and is another kind of critical theme I'd note, the question of aesthetic meaning, the role of art and culture, particularly in political movements, and whether they're important for our understanding of freedom, of liberation, or the ability to think and imagine morally about other human beings and understand our moral commitments, right? So in Adorno and Horkheimer, we have serious concerns that the disenchantment of modernity, right, the kind of pervasive meaninglessness that comes with a purely instrumental scientific worldview, which is what Nietzsche heavily criticizes, might actually start to degrade our ability to engage in meaningful forms of moral agency, to recognize one another as equals, right, in a way that is really demanded by any kind of conceivable left politics, right? Any conceivable egalitarian politics. And that, I would say, would encompass the spectrum from liberal to left, right? In the sense of a kind of broad spectrum commitment to egalitarianism. So I think it's interesting. I mean, I turn the question around to some extent and say, the question is, what can the left learn from Nietzsche? Well, the left has already learned quite a bit from Nietzsche in many ways. And there's an argument to be made that Nietzsche has already been incorporated to a great deal into much of social and cultural critique among the left today. So the question arises of sort of why not, right? Why not go back to Nietzsche again for resources as a great thinker who's inspired, these other kind of left political thinkers in the past? What the counter to this is what I think of as a sort of contamination thesis, which I think you've already sort of mentioned, or at least implied, which is the idea that there's something dangerous about reading Nietzsche, perhaps. There's something seductive about him that could lead you astray from a properly left or particularly Marxist orientation. I think these criticisms and thinkers like Domenico Lacerdo most often come from a Marxist orientation. And I think I would I turn the question around to say that it's incumbent, I think, upon people who would correctly point out aristocratic and egalitarian, perhaps even proto-fascist elements that emerge in Nietzsche's thought, maybe in certain notes. I would challenge them, kind of put the onus on them to kind of demonstrate the truth of the contamination, right? To demonstrate that there's a real risk in going astray in reading, rather than the possibility of another fruitful, right? And I think usually this will be attached to some sense that these other engagements weren't fruitful, right? That there's something wrong with the postmodern left, right? That is already going astray from Marxism proper, right? So I think it's important to recognize also then that the question of whether Nietzsche is useful to the left is already tied to questions about the French New Left, May 1968, and its significance, right? They're tied to questions of division within the left already.
Right. And that's actually the topic of next week's podcast, because I'm having a guest who's pretty much Daniel Tudd, whose thesis more or less is the contamination thesis. And I mean, I'll let him speak for himself when he goes on. But one of the arguments is that Nietzsche is already the philosopher of late capitalism. And he's influenced the left, but by influencing the left by those figures you mentioned, Foucault, Deleuze, he doesn't give us a philosophy that really leads to emancipatory politics, but rather if anything, kind of reinforces the already hegemonic mode of capitalism, which one of the arguments being perspectivism. Nietzsche, of course, is more not a moral relativist per se, but more somewhat of a some might say moral nihilist, not a nihilist in a, of course, existential sense, opposing nihilism, but in the sense that, he doesn't really believe in like finding objective truths, and he's much more skeptical of that kind of thinking. And
I would that on I think if that's essential to the thesis, I would contest that on a fundamental level. I think that is basically a misreading of Nietzsche's epistemology.
the
So I
perspectivism,
think this is a major weak spot of these interpretations, and it particularly relates it to this sort of Frederick Jameson style kind of mode of cultural interpretation, where we treat Nietzsche as kind of a sign of a postmodern culture that is essential to like structurally essential to
right?
late
He's
capitalism.
been sometimes described as like a
Right.
godfather of postmodernism.
Right. And you can make a case historically, perhaps, that this is true, or at least when it comes to post-structuralist thought in the French tradition. The question then whether Nietzsche fits into what Jameson identifies as the culture of postmodernism is, I think, complicated, and I think I guess I would not go so far as to say demonstrably wrong in the sense of interpretation, that Nietzsche is a complex thinker. It's difficult to refute, and probably wrong-headed to try to refute anybody's particular interpretation of someone who's so complex and rich. But I would argue the opposite. I would argue that Nietzsche is in some ways the prophet predicting the perils of postmodernism, predicting exactly that the postmodern era would arise out of sort of the chaos of the modern soul. The inability to produce any kind of grand unified style in art, right, that could give expression or meaning to human existence, right? And this is what's puzzling and dangerous about Nietzsche, but it's also certainly not postmodern, right? It's not an embrace of the fragmentary and the embrace of multiplicity per se. It's really an idea of how does artistic art give unity to a culture, right? And these are questions that I think are important for the left to think through, right? Particularly if we're thinking through the question of what is the unity of the cultural capitalism, right? And we're looking for critical tools to analyze that, to understand how critique, whether it's political or artistic and cultural form, can achieve some kind of autonomy from the logic. I think the idea that lumps Nietzsche in with a kind of postmodern mentality of kind of selling out to pure self-expression, to authenticity, these kind of ideals that are often articulated in the kind of consumer capitalist culture. I think the opposite is true. I think Nietzsche is one of the harshest critics of just that type of bourgeois culture in all of its.
Actually, I would agree with you, because I find his critique of capitalism to be fascinating, because he thinks capitalism is, in a sense, too democratic, because it has to appeal to the masses, and because it appeals to the masses, you have all these, have to water everything down, and you get get mass culture. And I can kind of see the influence on Adorno there with that. I actually don't think that critique is particularly wrong. Anyone who's made YouTube videos knows that you have to dumb yourself down just to get more views. And
I think it's a point where it's important to disentangle different versions of this critique, right? And to show how different versions arise in Nietzsche, and that we can sort of try to understand what motivates Nietzsche in different directions, right? Because I think one of the underlying questions here is to kind of disentangle the issue of, well, what was Nietzsche personally, right? Was Nietzsche personally a reactionary, a radical aristocrat,
right,
in Lyserga's terms, right? Where his politics in himself were, right? And I think the answer to that has to be yes on a biographical level, right? The question then of how we understand his thought, right, as a work, as a body of work, right, both in its own kind of philosophical unity and its influence thereafter. There, I think the matter is much more complicated, and I think it's not sufficient to simply point out that Nietzsche himself was maybe personally reactionary, or that certain reactionary tendencies come through in his work, because this is an example of a point that, again, as you know, becomes significant as a similar argument that becomes significant for the Frankfurt School, where the issue isn't the massification per se, right? It's not the disgust with the plebeian, right, which you get plenty of in Nietzsche, right? It's a concern with the homogenizing tendencies of modern inequality, particularly as they're expressed in the universal equivalent of money under capitalism, right? And the fact that capitalism, qua commodification, ruins culture, right? Not because it makes it common in the sense of catering to the masses necessarily, but that it is it is yoked to the logic of accumulation rather than any kind of aesthetic standard.
And it
right?
homogenizes the masses, right? As Marcuse
Homogenize the masses
described
as
a
well,
lot.
right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And this is, I think, as I think we're pointing out here, this is an area where I think, once again, you find both strains of this, right? And it can often be difficult to disentangle. But I think what we've done here is sort of distinguish between how these themes do get taken up in capitalism, where the modern ideal of equality takes on a pernicious form of a sort of total assimilation of everything to the logic of money, right? And loses its emancipatory function, right? Which is to recognize equal human dignity, right? Of each individual in their distinctiveness. And so I think these cultural critiques are important for the left. I think this is something that can still go missing. And I think it's not just important empirically in terms of, how we see it enter into the logic functioning of capital, in some of these Frankfurt School thinkers. It's also important normatively. I think we shouldn't deprive ourselves of the critique of capitalism that it produces mediocre culture on the whole in comparison to what maybe we could imagine an emancipated society producing, right? It's important to maintain maintain the possibility of a kind of perfectionist critique of capitalism that isn't just calling attention to this is horribly exploitative, right? This is horribly exploitative, it's destroying the earth. It's also deeply circumscribes the universe of possibilities of what human beings can do, right? Stultifies most human beings by enslaving them to a job and wages, the need to make wages that dominates their life, right? Narrowing the horizons of possibilities, so they're simply concerned with self-interest and the accumulation of money, right? Calling attention to the ways this is destructive to anything that can resemble a, free aesthetic expression, I think remains an important language of critique that the left should still use. I don't think we should deprive ourselves of that language in advance by somehow saying it's inherently reactionary and it's inherently elitist. I think there are ways of articulating that perfectionist critique of capital that are not inherently elitist. And I think that you can also find resources for that in Nietzsche, right? You can find resources for an inherently elitist conception as well. And I wouldn't deny that, right? But it is part of what makes Nietzsche so interesting is that he is a sufficiently rich thinker that he has been found valuable by such a broad spectrum of political traditions and also philosophical traditions. It sort of speaks to why we might not be able so easily replicate Nietzsche's insights by, say, turning to turning to Max Stirner, for example, which is a common kind of turn I hear on the left today. You can get kind of similar ideas out of Stirner that you can get in Nietzsche. I think I would question that. I would question whether we can really replace Nietzsche in kind of history of ideas and also as a resource for thinking through the dialectic.
Right. Yeah. And this is a very important source of the contentions around Nietzsche, because I think what I would imagine the contamination hypothesis, those who are proponents of it, would say in response to that is, yes, he's criticizing modernity, he's criticizing capitalism in a certain sense, but he's doing it from an aristocratic point of view, which is more reactionary than the likes of a left critique of modernity from the likes of Marx. Now, my sort of response to that would be we can kind of take elements of what is true in that critique, but it can be applicable to the rest of the rest of us, the rest of the classes. Now, here's I think the thing that I would be curious about is it saying that Nietzsche's critique, his work itself, is not just purely aristocratic, and that there's elements of it that have a um, uh, you can have a left reading of it, or is it more so that you can absorb aspects of what he's critiquing and analyze it ourselves from a different class standpoint? Because I think there's two different things going on, two different approaches. One can kind of reinterpret Nietzsche from this left angle, or one can see him as this aristocrat, as this
Right.
aristocratic thinker, and then say, but what about it? What he's saying is true, because that's the way I read some people like Schmidt, for example. Carl Schmidt was a Nazi, but what about what critiques of liberal democracy did he have that were accurate in terms of contradictions. And I don't know.
Yeah.
So which of those?
No, I think that's right.
Do you
I think
take
the
both of those
comparison is accurate.
perspectives, or do you take one of them over the other in terms of?
Yeah, think of how I want to approach this. Because I think there are three things that I want to say, and like three different approaches that can be taken. So the first question that I think you raise here is the question of class position, how that relates to our interpretation of Nietzsche, right? And I would say that I'm uncomfortable with that kind of, I would call it class abstractionism, in the sense of the reduction of a thinker's work in any particular case to strictly a class function, right? I think that too has to be seen as a dialectic that goes on and kind of unfolds within the thinker between a class position and certain fundamental aspects of their thought, right? And we can make the argument that that class position is there in Nietzsche, but I see this often as begging the question in cases of Lacerdo, for example. And obviously, Tut's book has yet to come out, so I will withhold judgment until I'm able to read it. But there's something question begging about coming to Nietzsche with a Marxist frame and a Marxist interpretive frame, right? Which is going to treat the function of his text as essentially an ideological one, right? And then coming away with the conclusion that it plays an ideological function. And this plays out as more or less a self-fulfilling prophecy, when I think the opposite should be the case, even if we don't want to specifically take resources from Nietzsche, say, to adapt his thought for a different class position. The question should still be, does he represent a serious challenge to the emancipatory ideal, to certain ideals of morality that still are embedded within Marxism or any other tradition of left-wing anarchism, et cetera, right? And the reason that, and this is, I think, a critical point that we haven't quite discussed yet, which is that part of what's fruitful in Nietzsche is not just, this kind of practical issue of like, let's find concepts as resources that we can take and adapt for political purposes, right? Nietzsche will, in reading him, force you to suspend that kind of instrumental thinking, in kind of in favor of a more deeper challenge to yourself psychologically and what you are, that I think cuts against the idea that his text strictly serves an ideological one. But in that sense, I think Nietzsche should be seen as launched, to the extent that he is a critic of the left, should be seen still as launching a criticism that is worth taking into consideration and worth defeating, right? So even if you are of the view that Nietzsche is one of these kind of arch reactionaries, one of the kind of key figures of the reactionary right-wing political tradition, right? What he raises is the threat, I'd say, of a tragic existence, or the threat of tragedy, in a way that the left, particularly in its Marxist Hegelian form, might not be suited to overcome it, right? So the Nietzschean challenge would say that the kind of Hegelian Marxist teleological theory of history is founded upon a kind of optimistic faith in reason. The idea that with increasing consciousness, increasing self-consciousness, as we greater and greater articulate the structures of reason, both the world and ourselves will thereby become more and more intelligible to us as well, right? Nietzsche is raising the possibility of what Bernard Williams calls the threat of partial intelligibility, the possibility that maybe we face a universe that does not align perfectly with our ethical interest, right? And our ethical. And this is a view that is often seen as a hallmark of much conservative thought, right? I think Nietzsche should be seen as posing a fundamental challenge to the left to get past its optimism, right? To say this tragic worldview does not need to be a defense of the status quo, right? Saying life's unfair, you just have to accept kind of injustice as it currently exists, right? It needs to be a recognition how we sustain hope and sustain faith in emancipatory possibilities in the face of their continual defeats, right? And in the face of also a trajectory of history now that I don't think anybody can plausibly say is trending towards some kind of revolutionary installment utopia, right? We get closer, I think, or what we look at in the future when it comes to, for example, climate crisis. I think we are forced to conclude something a little closer to Adorno's comment that there's a universal history that goes from the slingshot to the atom bomb, right? There is a universal history. We face the threat that it's one that's destructive rather than progressive. And I think Nietzsche is the thinker that forces us to engage with these problems in the most profound way in the Western tradition, or at least in 19th and 20th century European thought. And I think it's a fruitful engagement for the left to have, even if we come away rejecting fundamental aspects of Nietzsche's thought. Not only because it's important to be able to respond to the criticism that we hold our beliefs not because we've thought through them critically, but only as a kind of reflexive function of our position in life in some fashion, right? Which we risk falling prey to if we start by viewing Nietzsche from our own framework in terms of class position. I think it's also a matter of, I think it's fundamentally a matter of how we have that encounter with his text and whether we can incorporate this sort of tragic challenge, tragic insight into utopian aspiration, not as its opponent, but as a kind of companion that forces us to reckon with and get past utopia's failures so that we can continue pursuing it. So that's the theme that I think I tend to emphasize the most, is this question of tragedy and detaching the tragic worldview from a strictly conservative standpoint and saying, no, this tragic perspective is actually quite important for understanding fundamental questions about the philosophy of history, teleology, utopia, that are integral, arguably, to the Marxist tradition.
Right. Yeah, you bring up actually what I wanted to segue towards, which is sort of the concepts of Nietzsche that we should actually take seriously, that are challenges to the left, like slave morality. But first, I got to defend my Hegelian brothers for a second. The Marxist Hegelians, friends, because what you described of the teleological view of history, I think is very true of the sort of Stalinist type of Marxism, the dialectics that views dialectics as a way of overcoming contradiction, and the synthesis, as opposed to kind of constant contradiction, constant tearing with the negative. Because obviously with Marxist Hegelians, you can go from Stalin to Engels and Marx, to Stalin to Mao Zedong, to Zizek and Marcuse. They all have their kind of different approaches of it, right? So I think, though, as a true Hegelian, one would tear with that negative challenge that Nietzsche is presenting. I mean, he presents us with this negativity that I think haunts leftism. And after studying the Cultural Revolution for quite a while, which is subject of my next video, I think you look at that, you can't see that Nietzsche wasn't onto something with regard to slave morality and a kind of this had a basis of politics being sort of a politics of negation, being you're bourgeois as opposed to what is being created, because then it cannibalizes itself. And I mean, some people have also drew connections between Nietzsche and what people use today as cancel culture, but that term describes all sort of different things. But I think some elements of it are important. And that brings me to the question, and that is, which aspects of Nietzsche particularly, and you alluded to them with regards to we shouldn't reject the massification, the problem of homogenization in capitalism, which can be read in elitist terms, and of course Adorno, Marcuse, who have elements of different variations of such critiques of capitalism, are accused of elitists. But if so, it's a kind of elitism I would agree with. I don't really think it's elitist in a hierarchical, essential sense, but rather a sense of recognizing difference in the way systems shape people in terrible ways, and that there is indeed a decadence that capitalism brings. Might not be for the same reasons Nietzsche viewed that decadence, right? But something is to be reckoned with, and I guess that we might as well go right to it. Is what exactly, conceptually, does Nietzsche pose as that challenge that we should deal with? Particularly, I guess, slave morality, guilty conscience, moralistic thinking. There's a whole lot of things I can think of, and you already brought up disenchantment. But maybe let's get into actually the moralistic critique, because I think that is among one of the most useful things.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're getting into the kind of nuts and bolts of the genealogy, particularly in the first essay where he discusses the slave revolt morals and resentment, ressentiment, the French word that he uses. I think that really gets to the heart of the issue, because it goes back to the question that you raised about negation, right? And this is central to Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche and why he places Nietzsche kind of as in opposition to Hegel. With Hegel, remembering, of course, that we are also adapting a conservative, someone who was a fundamentally conservative thinker, to revolutionary, right? worth noting when it comes to the Hegel-Marx connection.
I would
but suffice
contest that, but
well,
I would say for his time, Hegel was a progressive thinker, and so is Napoleon. Napoleon as a figure was progressive for his time. The right-wing deviation from his. That's another story we could get on, but yeah.
But the question of negation, I think, in affirmation goes to the heart of it, right? Negation is the fundamental mechanism of the dialect, right? Hegel reads the kind of division within consciousness through which the self reaches out towards something other than itself, while also relating that back to it as a form of negation, conceptual negation, in effect, right? That provides a principle that gradually unfolds greater and greater articulations of reason, right? And I think with Nietzsche, what Nietzsche is raising is the fundamental question of what role negation plays in the overall scheme of moral reasoning in relation to a question. Basically, I would describe it as the problem of evil, the problem of evil or problem of suffering. The problem of evil, right, which Nietzsche talks in the preface of the Genealogy as being interested in from the time he was 13 and being the subject of his first attempted philosophical essay, raises the issue of how do we affirm an existence that involves great suffering, right? Why not an existence that's purely good, right? And of course, this becomes acute only in particular contexts, you could argue, right? In the Christian context of an omnipotent and benevolent God, then it becomes the question of why would that God create, right? But for Nietzsche, I think he extracts, and particularly in talking about the ancient Greeks and tragedy, a different and more fundamental question from that, which is, given the reality of suffering, let's just say in the present, bracketing the question of whether there is a utopian possibility that finally eliminates suffering, right? Granting the existence of suffering in the present, how do we avoid descending into a kind of spiral of negation that paralyzes any action in any progress forward, right? How exactly do we take the step out of strict negation and critique into creative and productive act, right? And you can see Nietzsche then is posing this question of how exactly do we affirm existence, right, as worth living and therefore as worth being a kind of a basis for future action. How do we affirm that despite a persistent need to negate and critique the present? And the concern would be then that a purely negative approach falls into the sort of trap that I think many people would argue Adorno falls into at the end of the day, this sort of detached, critical, ascetic perspective, right? That can only kind of stand back from a totally false society, rejecting it completely, right? As totally commodified, totally colonized by capital, right? And forced into a position of only kind of abstract and powerless aesthetic, right? So I think Nietzsche is raising the concern that, one, a dialectical thinking perhaps is inherently negative and inherently evades the moment of synthesis, that Hegel's is wrong to have a teleological faith that a moment of synthesis is possible, right?
Hegel doesn't think synthesis ever happens, but that's another.
Well, he thinks that synthesis happens through determinate negation, right?
But
he
that
thinks
leads
that
to more
positive
right?
determination comes through negation, right? And this is, I think, a point that comes up essentially for Deleuze's critique. It's a question of how we think determination. I think this goes beyond, to some extent, what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Here we're talking less about the philosophical question than the existential issue of what kind of a society do we want to live in, and can we affirm, right? Does it create problems for our lives if we don't find that society meaningful or intelligible in terms of our kind of conception of moral ends as we understand, right? And I do think, regardless of how you read Hegel, it's essential to that dialectical movement that the society we live in, must be intelligible in terms of the categories of reason as we understand them. I must be able to recognize myself in that society. I must be able to recognize myself in others who are mediated through that society, right? There is an ideal of mutual recognition in that regard. And I think Nietzsche poses this question of intelligibility sharply in a different way that does represent a challenge to the Hegelian tradition, right? And the threat would be a sort of endlessly forestalled critique in which action never materializes, and thus the forces of will to power sort of accumulating amongst a kind of resistance movement start to tear at itself and become directed inward in a sort of bad conscience, right? And this is the critique, in effect, that Nietzsche lays out in the Genealogy of Morals. It's the danger of a system of moral valuations that's founded strictly in negation, right? That starts with the principle, you are evil. I identify that as evil, therefore I must be, rather than affirming some good quality in the self, recognizing one's distinctiveness as having that good quality. Maybe others don't have it, right? There is this inegalitarian moment, but affirming the positive essence of that quality, right, as a basis for value, and differentiating then on that basis, rather than starting with a moment of negation and extracting self-affirmation from that negation. So that's the essential difference in evaluation that Nietzsche argues in the first essay of the Genealogy. Slave morality, as he describes it, involves a reversal of the evaluating. The aristocratic noble mode of morality began with what he calls a pathos of distance, where the noble recognizes some quality that is noble within him or herself, and differentiates themselves on that basis from kind of the common lot of human beings, right? So as I said, this is the sort of hierarchical or inegalitarian. But Nietzsche's argument, I think the reason that it's relevant is to say that that was a mode of evaluations that had its moment in a certain earlier aristocratic age of humanity. As he tells us midway through the essay, slave morality is one, right? In the modern age, we live in an era defined by 2 millennia of what he calls anti-nature, or morality, slave morality designed to separate human beings from what they can do in the ways that they confirm one, right? So there's no question of going back to that earlier aristocratic morality. There's only really a question of turning this critique towards the morality that we have inherited and are bound to in some fashion, even if it is bound to in a way that we'd like to criticize the side of it. And there, I think we have to confront the possibility that he is correct in his analysis of a great deal of Christian morality in particular, right? And the ways that Christian morality has shaped much of the Western tradition, particularly in this idea that slave morality through negation is founded in a kind of world denial, right? That it can only affirm life on the basis of some transcendent end, that in being only achievable after life and being kind of framed purely against the qualities of this existence, right, ends up designating this world as essentially inferior, essentially undesirable, right? Essentially something that we wish to escape from. And we can see the ways that that theme plays out in Christianity with regards to the body, with regards to sexuality, right? In ways that we are still trying on the left to emancipate ourselves, right? I think Nietzsche's critique in this regard remains indispensable. But I think the critical point here is that it can be very difficult on a certain reading of the Marxist and the Hegelian tradition to capture some of the same critiques if we maintain faith in a sort of optimistic guarantee of history, the riddle of history being solved, as it were, right? Rather than saying perhaps history continues as a series of struggles, right, in which tragedy will always remain present, right? And there's a fundamental moral question, not just of how we emancipate ourselves from injustice, but also how we combine that with a need to affirm a firm existence in its rather than in a constant flight from existence into transcendence.
I think, well, what you just described at the end is the Hegelian view, but it's often been misinterpreted. But what you are describing is accurate of Marxism, I think, like in terms of this idea of the end of history and end of politics.
Right.
But I think for Hegel, there's always contradiction. But then we're going to bring more Nietzsche-Hegel debate, which is a little bit too complicated. I think we're more going to focus on Nietzsche and his political implications and relevance to the left, right? But you bring up that the point about morality, right? And I think having a politics of affirmation as opposed to pure negation is a very important point on the left. And what struck me is when I first read Beyond Good and Evil, and the essay regarding genealogy of morality, and then there's the genealogy as well, the individual book. The way I saw it was he hated Christianity because of its slave morality that it promoted, but he thought it kind of empowered the poor, the weak, and he didn't like that. But the way I read it was he's describing something real, but I think it actually does the opposite of empower the poor. I grew up in a Catholic school and stuff, and I always found that that kind of Christian language, the meek shall inherit the earth, that it kind of stays in the left, which is we'll be the better person. Violence is always bad. We'll be the better person. We'll reject power. I always thought that that kind of was a sort of copium, that the moral system that no, let's not use the morals of the oppressor. We're good. We're good by default because we don't use such tactics. I always thought to be disempowering. I don't know
Right.
what you think on that, because I think the reason why those who are anti-Nietzsche would say, well, he's saying this because he hates the poor. He thinks Christianity is too socialist. I would say I agree, but is he not onto something with regards to this sort of disempowering rhetoric? It's why I always have been critical of leftist politics, that for example, they say, oh, we should just tax the rich. I mean, how does that empower us? What about seizing the means of production? What about building organs of power for everybody else who does the work, right? As opposed to this,
I,
I don't know.
I,
Would you like to
to
elaborate
me,
on that?
that's the sort of like vitalist moment within Marx that, is more there in the 1844 manuscripts, and then retreats to some extent later on when things become more technical, either in Capital or more detailed class analyses and things like the 18th Brumaire. This question of living labor as a moment of creative affirmation, right? But you get this kind of emphasized in Marxist thinkers like Tony Negri, for example. Trying to extract that like affirmative and creative aspect of labor as that which produces more than is strictly necessary, and therefore affirms some kind of freedom above and out of necessity, right? I think that that's something that has close affinities with Nietzsche, and I think is an important moment in Marxism, right? That I think we're getting at here. And I think the question that you have when it comes to the question of moralizing and its disempowering aspect does raise the question of whether that represents another form of alienation from the fundamental creative, right? And I think this is where Nietzsche does already anticipate the kind of concerns that you're raising here, right? So much of the third essay of the Genealogy on the ascetic ideal is precisely dedicated to explaining why the ascetic ideal, as a sort of medicine that the priest prescribes for the sick and suffering, nonetheless serves to intensify their suffering and worsen the illness, right? And this is where I think there's the fundamental disconnect. If we just say, well, Nietzsche hated the poor, right? We have really no sense of the motive behind that critique, right? We have no sense of the pathological mechanism that he is diagnosing in the ascetic ideal, or why he thinks, as you said, it makes, as in kind of Marx's words, that the constant wage labor and being prevented from being free to realize the ends of one labor does accumulate as a degrading experience, is felt that way by people who labor, right? I feel that way at the job, even though I have a fairly easy job. But the reality is that's something that Nietzsche is certainly highlighting here. And I think that it goes back to what I was talking about earlier as the sort of perfectionist question, the perfectionist moment. He is saying that on the one hand, the slave revolt means that this ascetic slave morality has become ascendant in civilization, right? But he is also saying, no, it doesn't empower us, right? It quite universally separates us from what we can do eminently within this world based on the promise of some next, right? And I think there is a great deal of power for the analysis for connecting that idea of the ascetic ideal to a critique of capitalism, to the extent that you can argue that capitalism structurally builds asceticism of a kind into its essence, right? The principle of accumulation is precisely the idea of saving, for future accumulation that is as an end in itself, as it were, rather than being spent productively and realized, right? This principle governs the entirety of the system, right? You can see how that leads into more explicit analyses like Weber's Protestant ethic about the way religious asceticism is essential to the formation of capitalism, right? Giving up ends in the present in order to be frugal, in order to save for the future, in order to accumulate, right? You can detect the operation of the ascetic ideal within this. And I think that complexity that you're noting is really, really there in Nietzsche. And the kind of real motive behind his thought and the real reasoning is not on the side of his reactive dislike for the plebeian masses. It's on the side of this fundamental issue that he's detected within Western morality and culture, that he sees as building in certain principles that are hostile to life, right? That if we succumb to them, would threaten to undo the emancipatory ends that we are trying to achieve. That's the critique, I think, that has to be taken seriously.
Are you saying that Nietzsche is saying that about the emancipatory ends, or that's your interpretation? Because
I think that I would argue that the complexity is already there in Nietzsche's text, and that is what prevents us from really deciding it as his text as a function, as playing simply a class function. A good example would be the aphorism, "The Impossible Class" in Dawn, which is one of his middle works. This is a fascinating and as I said, complex, many-sided, right, and possibly undecidable analysis of the working class in Europe, and precisely the conditions under which being chained to a system of wage labor separates that class from its potentialities for acting in the world. And he imagines a kind of flowing out of Europe and this is where it gets complex. This is connected with a colonialist vision in some ways, right? A flowing out of Europe to other places of the world to realize that freedom. But it's also paired with a recognition that the kind of narrow capitalist utilitarian ideal is stultifying the potentialities of that class, right? Is separating them from their will to power. So I think, the elitism and aristocratic, endorsement of aristocracy is undoubtedly there in Nietzsche, but so is a recognition of some of these pathological tendencies in capitalism, and not just pathological in the sense of they disrupt the proper ruling class, but in the sense that they unleash an overall kind of cultural movement towards despair and nihilism that ultimately worsens the lot of the working class as well. I think if you're looking for where this kind of stuff comes up in Nietzsche, the critique of capitalism really is mostly in his middle works, in Human, Also Human, and Dawn. Later on, it kind of shifts away from his focus. But there really is, I think, an underappreciated series of texts there that go in conjunction with his critique of utilitarianism that, do offer a powerful criticism of forms of wage labor and capitalism and the way they circumscribe the universe of human possibility and freedom, with some ones that I still think are valuable to pair with kind of Marxist analysis of alienated labor. So I do think I would say it's not just us kind of, taking Nietzsche's thought in another direction. I would challenge this kind of more homogenizing and simplistic reading of Nietzsche to say that he's already multiple. He was a madman who contained multitudes within himself, and you can detect those multitudes in his text in a way that's very difficult to unify and decide.
right. Well, I might. So there's a lot of things that are very interesting that we could draw on right there. But you mentioned that the um, Protestant work ethic and sort of that has been an ideology, right? As Max Weber famously articulated in the book of the same title, to really be the justification for perpetuating capitalism. However, some would say, like theorists like Byung-Chul Han, who I've covered a lot in my videos, and Slavoj Žižek, or the various thinkers, Christopher Lasch, Culture of Narcissism, would say that the new capitalism is quite different, and if anything, it has a sort of uh, ideology that places an expectation on the individual that you can become anything. Not that you should do this, or you must do this, or you can't do that, but you can do anything, and that you treat yourself almost like a project. And it's if anything, it is a sort of affirmation, but for like a gig economy, neoliberal capitalism in which it's consumer based. So like I think that's where the people like Daniel Tutt are getting their critique as to why Nietzsche is a philosopher of late capitalism. Now, would you say that there's a way that we, because like, of course I can see that as well. Like you see in self-help culture today, there's a lot of this idea. Or Andrew Tate resembles. I think Andrew Tate is a right-wing Nietzschean. You've heard of Andrew Tate, right?
Yeah.
His whole thing is, the system is absolutely broken. It's decadent, but you need to have he channels this sort of will to power. You just need to conquer by any means necessary, reject. It's like you could say it's an Ayn Rand reading of Nietzsche to a certain extent, the way he thinks. And I can see how people take it in that direction. But what would the direction for someone who believes in a sort of emancipatory politics on the left, what would that look like as opposed to that? Because I think that's where we can get a counter argument to the contamination hypothesis, or that Nietzsche's philosopher of late capitalism, etc.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, I saw it as we should just form our politics as to what we want, as opposed to just what we want to negate, like as opposed to anti-capitalism.
Let me take the question in two parts. First, with the question of kind of Nietzsche and the culture of late capitalism, and second, with the the question of Andrew Tate and right Nietzscheanism, right? So when it comes to the culture of late capitalism, I think this goes back to what I want to try to elaborate a little further on what I was suggesting earlier, which is that Nietzsche is really the harshest critic of that culture, rather than somebody who would endorse this kind of thin, flimsy ideal of authenticity, just kind of open-ended self-creation. It's honestly incredible to me the extent to which people associate with Nietzsche. Nietzsche's texts are replete with ethical exhortations to engage in harsh forms of discipline for the sake of your morality. The entire idea of the Übermensch, right, is a picture of that which stands over man, right? It is a picture of that ideal which stands above us, right, which is greater than simply our own self-expression and thus justifies our existence in some, right? Any ideal of morality in the higher sense that Nietzsche describes involves its own forms of asceticism. The question is that for the sake of which the asceticism is being undertaken, whether the asceticism is taken as an end in itself that becomes a sickness that gnaws away at the subject endlessly with no goal, or whether the asceticism is for the sake of some kind of higher creation or higher birth, right? It's the sake of transfiguration to something else that is more valuable. And what Nietzsche particularly would criticize, I think, is twofold. One, it's the culture of fragmentation in postmodernism that has no unifying theme, right? No unifying style, but instead caters to this patchwork of infinite styles, whatever sells, right? Whatever will take on the form of the commodity, right? I think that is very much connected to the kind of what he sees negatively as the democratic ethos. He connects it, for example, to Plato's critique of democracy and the republic, right? As a patchwork of, many, quilt with many colors. It's a constitution that mixes all sorts of principles into a kind of fragmented chaos, right? So that's, to me, is far from Nietzschean on its own, right? The idea is how you organize that chaos, give it a unified style to, as Nietzsche says, give birth to a dancing star of a new valley, right? So I think the people who associate Nietzsche with that kind of culture of late capitalism are need to be more attentive readers in my view. I think they particularly need to attend to what Nietzsche considers to be a valuable culture and aesthetic style, and the way in which forms of unity are essential. It's just that those forms of unity are won through passing through chaos, right? And I think this takes us to the second bit with Andrew Tate, which is that what I often find odd about these individuals is that they seem, the lives that they seem to argue for on the basis of Nietzsche are totally antithetical to Nietzsche's own life. Nietzsche's life was dominated by an intense struggle with sickness from his very early age, right? He had blinding headaches, near total loss of his eyesight, horrible nausea and indigestion that led to hours-long bouts of vomiting, right? And this persisted throughout his life. And that's not even discussing the kind of the mental illness that eventually led to him psychosis, right? Nietzsche's quest for health, his quest for power, comes from within a state of sickness. It does not come from, importantly, cannot come from some reflexive recognition of oneself as the Übermensch type, right? And this goes back, I think, critically to the point that I was making earlier. There's a temptation to take Nietzsche's analysis of slave morality and master morality and say, well, we should just be like the masters, right? We just affirm what works for me, and I go from there, right? There's no point in conducting the genealogy, right? If it's not to show the way in which we are inextricably entwined with slave morality, a condition for our culture, right? It is within us. It defines us, not just insofar as we live in a modern bourgeois culture, but to some extent, it is deeply embedded in our being conscious entities to begin with, right? And this is a theme that Nietzsche will talk about, particularly in the beginning of the second essay of the Genealogy. Any sense of cultural excellence and nobility has to be won through a critique of decadence that recognizes the way in which we are complicit with that, the way in which our own culture is defined by that decadence, right? And that is the critical move that I think is utterly missing from the Andrew Tate or Bronze Age pervert types. There's an idea that somehow the self can be abstracted away from the corrupt quite easily through an act of will from the culture that gave birth to it, and simply liberated in the name of some kind of greater health. To me, that is the exact opposite of the arduous, disciplined, ethical work that Nietzsche demands, which instead demands recognizing the extent to which any of us as members of this culture are complicit in the same decadence. And that, I think, is to me a critical breaking point with the right Nietzscheans, that it is a different mode of critical analysis, and that in some sense, when you act as if I recognize myself as an aristocrat. I'm a strong individual. You're outing yourself as kind of falling prey to Nietzsche's rhetorical traps in some fashion. You're in some sense identifying yourself as a sick individual demanding recognition from others for one's own power.
Yeah, no, you raised a lot of good points there. And I think one thing, though, that is a big question to me is you're saying that Nietzsche would reject this sort of idea that, what people often take as a sort of the relativist culture of capitalism, the kind of idea that, um, well, we all have different opinions, everything is as good as every other, and a lack of a total unifying vision, an affirmative ideology that can actually, uh, as opposed to like everyone is on their own. I also see that in Nietzsche, especially in like chapters like what is noble in Beyond Good and Evil. I mean, I think he has a very anti-bourgeois view, but it's an aristocratic view that is almost wants this class of people who is so above money that they can, spend time on higher human pursuits. It's almost like a little bit like Marxism for the rich, in a certain sense, at least how I see it. But now, how would you reconcile though that a lot of Left-Nietzschean.
Hold on. I lost you. You muted yourself there.
Oh, how would you reconcile? When did I mute?
It was right after how do you reconcile a lot of
Right.
Left-Nietzscheans?
Yeah. How would you reconcile the fact that a lot of Left-Nietzscheans, such as Deleuze, Foucault, and Baudrillard, tend to reject grand narratives? They tend to reject a totalizing, what they see as a totalizing vision, and sometimes to the pursuit of like universal truths, of universals, prioritizing difference over universality. How would you how does do you think that is something that does germinate from Nietzsche's thinking, or is that actually something different? It's though just their spin on Nietzsche, because it is something that I wrestle with. Is that kind of I tend to be skeptical of that type of thinking that, oh, we don't need grand narratives. I think it's makes sense philosophically if you're a pursuit of the complexity, but politics requires universals. I mean, society requires universality to some extent.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think it's a case where I think they're correct to identify, and I think, Deleuze's book on Nietzsche remains one of the most valuable contributions to Nietzsche scholarship, in my view, precisely by showing how what appears to be a strictly inegalitarian and hierarchical idea of power and forces actually has important implications for the question of how the self is constructed relationally and how we're able to affirm difference in a way that doesn't close ourselves off as a hegemonic kind of self-enclosed identity in a way that tries to protect against difference, right? I think that move is valid. And I think that it would be wrong to say that Nietzsche somehow restricts these insights to a description of an aristocratic pathos of distance. We find a pathos of distance in artists and creators of all sorts in Nietzsche, in any different kind of psychological type, just as we do find it within a social context, within the context of certain aristocratic groups, right? But when it comes to the question of universals, though, the question then becomes, well, is Nietzsche simply reacting back towards a kind of earlier aristocracy? So the criticisms of the bourgeois, for example, are still not, of course, in the favor of the emancipation of the proletariat, but in the favor of restoring, let's say, some kind of aristocratic regime. Well, here we run up against, I think, the problem, two related problems. One is that Nietzsche is fairly explicit, I think, in arguing that the bridge to the Übermensch is a going across, not a going back, right? We can't go back to the animal, we cross and overcome man, right? Man is something that is meant to be overcome. So there's an acceptance of modernity and modernism, Nietzsche, as something that is a condition of our lives and which we must move forward through, right? So it can't be any kind of unproblematic return to an older model of. But I think more deeply, in getting at the questions of universalism, I think you can make an argument for something like a form of universalism in Nietzsche, to the extent that Nietzsche, particularly in the Genealogy, but also elsewhere, articulates a form of deep sociality that is, in some sense, embedded in human consciousness as such, prior to differentiation into, individual cultures, so that he might diagnose and analyze throughout his books. But in essays like at the beginning of the second essay of the Genealogy, and in sections like on the origin of knowledge in the gay science. The idea is that this decadent model of kind of erroneous world-denying reasoning is not just the invention of Christianity. It's not just the invention of Socrates. It's a structure of some sort that is embedded in life, and particularly in consciousness itself. Consciousness in its form of conceptual identity functions by collapsing and relating together two fundamentally different things. It traffics in fictions such as enduring things and enduring entities. It believes in a facade like the free will. These, for Nietzsche, are not features of our nature that we can somehow easily change or get outside of. And in some sense, they are embedded in not the condition of a particular culture or particular race, but in the human condition, right? In the human animal, which he often describes. And I think this is an important point that is it is underrated in his thought. Sometimes this is described, Alexander Niemus describes this as immanent versus transcendent perspectivism, where immanent perspectivism involves the idea of a bunch of different conflicting perspectives, whereas transcendent perspectivism might be the idea that there's one kind of broad human perspective, right, that structures all of our kind of interactions and experiences of the world qua human. Kant might be an example of this. I would argue that Nietzsche in many cases is closer to Kant in this regard, and that the diagnosis that he gives of decadence, while it is played out in particular cultural forms throughout history in his text, is a diagnosis of something that is endemic to the human condition as such, and a logic that in some sense goes beyond and explodes human history into a more broader, more essential history of the will to power in life, within which human history must be contextualized in Nietzsche's view. And that really gets to the point of why we can't in any way comfortably escape what Nietzsche describes as decadence or world denial. Really, the critical task is that of what Foucault describes as getting free of ourselves, of recognizing, if we want to take this kind of path with Nietzsche, recognizing the way in which pernicious forms of world negation and world denial are embedded in our moralities and forms of life, just in spite of ourselves as human, and work to determine our actions in spite of ourselves, right? Which is the exact opposite of the idea of someone like Andrew Tate, who somehow believes he could detach himself through some pure act of strength and will from the society he's living in. This is a failed attempt in the Nietzschean view to revert back to, not instead of going across the bridge to the Übermensch, Andrew Tate is trying to backtrack in this respect. He's trying to return to some simple animality that doesn't actually incorporate, a word that Nietzsche uses often, incorporate the knowledge of modernity into a higher form of life. And that goes through a critical analysis of the self that shows the way in which the self is implicated in forms of world. That heads off any ability of Andrew Tate's sorts to confidently assert themselves as members of any kind of new aristoi, and also problematizes any of Nietzsche's own declaration, understanding that at times he is giving voice passionately to these aristocratic sentiments, and at other times calling himself a buffoon and a clown, and recognizing himself as a jokester who shouldn't be taken too seriously. This is kind of the question of Nietzsche's internal multiplicity and the critique he leverages against himself. That is a critique that is absent from the kind of pure superficiality of Andrew Tate and Bronze Age pervert types, I would say.
Well, this brings me to a question that I'm still quite unsure about, and that is precisely the nature of the concept of the will to power, because it's of course what draws people often to Nietzsche, but I do find two conflicting interpretations, because I get the sense from reading Beyond Good and Evil especially, and Genealogy of Morality, that the will to power is something that not everybody possesses. It's like it's denied by slave morality. It's denied by these forces. But the will to power is something that really paints a picture that it's exclusive to a few individuals.
I think that's
Well,
the opposite.
Well, see, I'm about to say the opposite interpretation, because in the Will to Power book, which of course he didn't never publish, but his sister put together, it's the one that they seem to always say that we shouldn't read because it was distorted. But in that, he says the will to power is in all beings. It's the source that drives all beings. So these contradictions at work. I mean, maybe it's worth clarifying, like, what is the will to power exactly, and why is it a useful concept? Because Deleuze even goes to redefine it. He says it's the will. He says it should be read as the will of power, as opposed to the will to power, right? So
exactly. So yeah, to just from a kind of textual standpoint, the point you made about the will to power, yes, it's important to recognize that the book, The Will to Power, was assembled and published by Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, his sister, after Nietzsche's death, right? It does not represent any text that Nietzsche himself assembled, even though he did at times work on outlines of a kind of proposed magnum opus that we titled Will to Power. There's a good reason to think that what that magnum opus eventually became was the book The Antichrist, and that he had no plans after that to continue work on any such masterpiece. So yes, we should always approach anything in The Will to Power, particularly with a big grain of salt. That said, what Deleuze is drawing from in his reading are writings on the will to power that probably are found only in the Nachlass and Nietzsche's unpublished books, with a few exceptions. Section 36 of Beyond Good and Evil, for example, is a section that articulates a more fundamental idea of the will to power that extends it as a principle beyond life to even the inorganic world. But I think the correct reading, at the very least, is certainly not that will to power is something that's exclusive to a few. Quite the opposite. I mean, it's explicitly in Genealogy that the slave revolt and the will to nothingness is still a will to power, right? Albeit a distorted one that has turned against itself and its conditions in some fundamental way, right?
Yeah,
So
and
slave
there's a comment
morality
about the Jews, right? Where he
tradition,
praises the Jews using the anti-Semitic trope that they kind of whatever. But he buys
right?
into the anti-Semitic trope, but he praises them for it, for using it as a will to power, right?
Exactly. So there's this kind of ironic and stereotyped admiration of transforming this slave morality into a condition of one's own exercise of power, right? So the slave revolt does in many ways represent that. The issue, though, is the underlying form of evaluation that is the condition of this life's power. For Nietzsche is in some sense in tension or in contradiction with the basic logic of life itself. And this gets us to the concept of will to power. Seen not as either a principle of empirical psychology, such as a kind of psychological drive to accumulate power, nor something that is a capacity exclusive to a few, but really understood as Nietzsche as a basic function of organic life and its character as procreating life. And I think my view of the will to power, the way I think about it, really goes back all the way to Birth of Tragedy to try to identify some core themes across Nietzsche's work. And this is before he's really stumbled upon the concept of will to power. But what he's concerned with in Birth of Tragedy is a topic we discussed, which relates to the problem of evil and affirmation. And the insight that he's getting at in this early book is that life is of a sort that it can't simply mutely tolerate its existence. It can't simply will to go on living. Nietzsche believes that it's integral to kind of the disposition of life that it has to affirm some kind of increase or expansion in its capacities for action, in its power for action, right? And this is manifest in not the struggle for mere survival, but in the act of procreation and the creation of a new entity and the creation and ongoing generations for Nietzsche. Procreation is a term that he often uses as a symbol for will to power. But it is a figure for what we can see as a kind of fundamental excess that is inscribed in life itself. Life can't simply tolerate the pain and suffering from existence. It has to create some kind of justification that would allow those to be born intelligent, right? And that is the sort of will to power and what distinguishes it from a mere will to survive. And it's important to see the will to power in Nietzsche as a kind of a blind function. It's in many ways pre-conscious and certainly pre-intentional. So will to power doesn't describe somebody who sets out with a deliberate project of accumulating power necessarily. Will to power describes instead a mechanism by which one drive, say a drive for ambition or a drive for glory, among a multiplicity within him has become dominant and through its will and kind of exerted domination over all of the rest of the drives, bringing them into a unity that leads him kind of by his nature to try to accumulate power. But the function of the will to power then is not at the level of the person who tries to accumulate power. It's at the level of this overall economy of life through which life restlessly seeks to create new forms and affirm and expand its capacity to act, rather than, say, as in Spinoza, simply persevering in existence. And so it's important that Nietzsche criticizes Darwin. He criticizes much of evolutionary theory for having a sort of inadequate conception of life as simply willing the continuation of life. Schopenhauer is another object of criticism for him here. He thinks that much of biology and much of organic life makes much more sense under the presupposition that anything that exists only insofar as it is able to act in relation to other acting things, right? And this means that there will be power clashes. It means that we will come up against resistance in our attempts to. And it also means that much of the value of life will be won through overcoming that resistance by realizing significant projects, right? That afterwards we find contribute to our capacity to experience joy in existence, right? And our experience, our ability to fulfill our desires, and right. And at this level, I think it's important to recognize Nietzsche understands this as principle of organic life as such. And I would argue actually as an ontological principle of forces in their existence, qua forces. That is the kind of theory that really only gets worked out in the notebooks, and doesn't really have much of an analog in his public. So I think when the will to power is viewed in that respect, that's, I think, how it enters into figures such as Bataille, for example, and the accursed share, the idea of general economy, the idea of a fundamental excess in life. And it's also the point where the will to power potentially intersects with the Marxist idea of living labor, and the idea that human labor is characterized by creating more than is strictly necessary. For Nietzsche, that would be not some kind of Aristotelian function of human labor, but kind of a basic essence of life as such. So that would be my, I guess, broad take on the will to power, and particularly why it shouldn't be read as kind of just a vulgar or crude description of somebody who has a psychological disposition that leads them to want to acquire power.
Could we say that that the question with the will to power is that everyone possesses it to an extent, right? But Nietzsche's concern is that of affirmation versus denial, because of course the will to power can be harnessed in a way that is not affirmative; it's purely negative. And I guess we could see that in just the fact that a lot of leftist protests, have slogans that are purely based on what they oppose. We oppose injustice. We oppose capitalism, but it's not so always geared to like what we exactly want. Or in the Cultural Revolution, the masses rebelling was an expression of their will to power. And but the issue is it was around anti-bourgeois tendencies. It was against the party, and when they purged enough party officials, they really ended up just going after each other. And I guess that's sort of maybe the way we could look at it is, do you think it's dangerous if, one, people on the left deny the fact that they have a will to power? Because I think this is another compelling critique, is this idea that, if the issue is that power corrupts, and that if you have the powerless come to a position of power, they will be by nature more benevolent than people who are already privileged. Because the paradox of the Cultural Revolution was the people who ended up embracing capitalism were actually the people who came from the proletarian backgrounds. Like all of the party members, like Deng Xiaoping, they were all actually from the poor backgrounds, and people who had better class backgrounds before were restricted. And I guess, I don't know, so because this is a very different way of thinking of politics, right? A lot of egalitarians tend to just deny this idea that there is this will to power, and that there's some who want to dominate and some who don't, and etc. Because Weber, right, being sort of Nietzschean, he comes in politics as a vocation with the presupposition people in politics want power,
Right.
but the question is the ethics and etc. But yeah, I don't know, like in what regard what should be the key lesson here for leftists regarding this will to power and how one approaches it and its relation to affirmation and negation?
Yeah. Well, I think the central lesson is probably put best by Foucault, that power is everywhere and it is dangerous, right? And that it is a dangerous delusion to imagine that you are not implicated in power relations in ways that not only might constrain your possibilities for action, but might also shape your sense of self and your capacity for self-affirmation. I think this is why Foucault focuses much of his idea of a kind of emancipatory project in his later work, this kind of idea of care of the self, is how the self critically detaches from certain forms of power, certain constituting power relationships that shape the self in a certain way, and starts to open up space for different sorts of potentialities to be expressed. I think this is where, like, it's important. I still wouldn't accept the kind of description of everyone has a will to power. Will to power is sort of a description of how life, the disposition or tendency within life itself, of how it exists, right? The idea would be closer to, somebody who has a immense athletic talents and always wants to get out physical energy is going to find that drive expressing itself, right? It won't be sufficient to just kind of decide rationally, kind of sit back and decide, well, do I want to actualize this talent or not? It will actualize itself through you in some fashion. That is its will to power. So any one of us would be defined by many different wills to power, right? We're always kind of trying to negotiate relations among, trying to harmonize in different ways. And I think that is the fundamental political lesson as well, affirming in some sense a continuity between the self, the society it lives in, that politics will be a continual negotiation of power relationships, and that the function of ideology in many cases is to deny the existence of inequality, deny the existence of a power relationship when one actually exists. It's mystifying, right? And this is where Nietzsche's unmasking critique, and you can see the powerful means to which, the powerful way that Poe uses it. I think we are asked to attend to the ways in which not only we are implicated in power relationships, but also in which denying power asymmetries can function as a tool of oppression and a tool of sustaining status quo forms of power, the institutions of power. And this idea that egalitarian ideals will not save us from the kind of practical task and the burden of judgment of negotiating those power relations in practice in the way that we're implicated in them. I think that is a dangerous delusion that Nietzsche is correct to want to unmask. And I think it's one that doesn't serve the left well. I think that it will serve most often to lead the left to being co-opted by those kinds of same types of mystification that cover up the way in which power is implicated in our everyday lives. So, one way to read Nietzsche's egalitarianism then is not to say, like, I'm endorsing any kind of fixed hierarchy. Say there are noble natures and base natures, then nobles should be, in a hierarchy over the base. Rejecting that, I instead seeing Nietzsche describing power asymmetry as embedded in human intersubjectivity itself, kind of describing the ways in which we always come at relationships with one another from a space of uncertainty, of unequal capacities, whether these mean different quantities of power or different qualities of things that we can do, right? And that part of negotiating the anxieties that come out of those asymmetries is a great deal of what goes on in the intersubjective life of action, whether it be political or otherwise. And I think to go back to this question of tragedy, kind of tragic sensibility would insist that we make our main critical task, let's say, the main task of our ruthless critique of everything existing, to kind of assess the ways in which power is everywhere, assess the ways in which we are not free from forms of power asymmetry, and to explore the ways in which those asymmetries can be transformed into different and more productive orders of rank, or different and more productive modes of value. Because, of course, any socialist society, is a point that I've made before and insist upon, will also have its own rank ordering of things. A socialist society has to be able to affirm itself as good in some way, right? As better than alternatives, and is going to have to designate other forms of society that are meaningfully worse in an ethical sense, right? So in this sense, rank ordering in Nietzsche, as Nietzsche describes it, is not a feature of social life. It's a basic function of moral determination. It's a function of any kind of moral system that would give coherent values for organizing a society. And instead of rejecting the idea of a rank ordering, the left should start working out its own more explicitly. That would be a provocation, I would say, Nietzschean provocation. It should be more explicit that a socialist society, for example, would see the likes of Andrew Tate or Matt Walsh as beneath it, right? As somehow unethical forms of life in a way that are incompatible with human flourishing as a socialist society understands itself, right? And I don't think that it's possible to imagine a society without making those kinds of evaluations in the present. And I think Nietzsche would argue we shouldn't shy away from that. And it is not something that is simply an automatic reactionary trait, is a feature of moral evaluation or normative reasoning itself.
And I think the thing you're really dealing with here is the whole question of equality and hierarchy, because this is actually the segue I was going to go to with the last question of our podcast, which is equality. I think is a very fascinating debate. But first, I want to point out a really good exemplification of a Nietzschean versus sort of more moralistic worldview with regards to the left is in the Foucault-Chomsky debate. There's this great moment where Chomsky is saying, well, the dictatorship, the left, the workers want to take power because it's what is just and what is fair. And Foucault is like, they want to take power because they want to take power. And he keeps reiterating that, and Chomsky is just baffled by this because he needs a rationalization behind it.
Right.
Whereas, I found that a very, very good moment. But with regards to equality, this is a very crucial question because a lot of people will dismiss Nietzsche on the left based on his inegalitarianism. But as people like Jonas Cheka, the YouTube channel CCK Philosophy, he has a book on how to philosophize with a hammer and sickle and on Marx and Nietzsche. He makes the argument that, well, Marx's socialism was never egalitarian, and that is true. I mean, in the sense that the basis of it isn't vague ideas of equality; it's based on each to according ability, to each according to their need, and it is an affirmative philosophy as opposed to this idea that we should just a vague idea of equality. He criticizes that extensively in
Is that well, morality in effect is
right, and well, this is the contention is, I mean, if not equality, because this is still to this day the way most leftists think of things. They think of things in equality. I mean, what is the issue with thinking with that, and what is better alternative as opposed to that moral compass of equality? Because of course you can, and see, I agree with you can already tell my bias here. I agree with this Nietzschean kind of position, but I see that a little at odds though with a bit of anarchism, which anarchism is anti-hierarchy as opposed to anti-class. And I think, well, what is the basis for why anti-hierarchy is good? And I see that in Marxism, the answer really is the emancipation of the human faculties as to why class is bad, because it restricts our potentialities. But why is hierarchy in general bad? If I can get an answer as to why exactly that is affirmative, I'd be convinced. But just bad in general, I see that as something going on. Because even there's Emma Goldman purports to be a Nietzschean, right? And I don't really...
wanted to adopt Nietzsche for the anarchists, famously.
Yeah, but I see in anarchism, though, a kind of elements of the left that I think is...
But one interesting feature is precisely that it doesn't concentrate power strictly. I think one feature of anarchism that comes through in the idea of mutual aid is the way in which, we have to negotiate anarchism, not just in the abolition of the state, but also within different axes of society in which power exercises itself, right? It's not just capital, it's not just the state. And this is a task in some ways of instituting equality, right? The fact that power relationships are ubiquitous transforms the challenge of establishing an equal society, right? So what's interesting is you will get pictures in endorsements of a certain kind of equality in Nietzsche, right? Now, Nietzsche believes that this equality is only possible in small aristocratic societies, right? But it does characterize the societies that he praises. And importantly, the idea is that the equality is established for the sake of some kind of greater activity of self-expression or self-realization, which the Greeks saw as the polis, right? As something that would enable them to live the good life rather than merely bare life itself, right? And that living that life and establishing freedom from necessity required instituting harsh political restraints to institute equality, precisely because of the recognition of how fragile it is, about how the extent to which power was a threat to those relationships. And that is the, I think, core of what is important about Nietzsche if we're thinking about egalitarian ideals on the left and thinking about what are the conditions under which we can realize an equal society, right? And this is a society not just in which people have broadly equal rights, but in which they're actually equally actualized in some fashion, right? At least so much as they can be. And I think what Nietzsche would argue, and what I argued, I've argued before in my doctoral dissertation, is that certain aesthetic claims that I call moral perfectionist claims about what is essentially great or admirable or beautiful in human existence in an aspirational way, which themselves involve some kind of inherent inegalitarianism, right? It means praising the distinctive greatness of, say, an artistic work over others, right? Even though while recognizing that there can be many other different great works that have entirely different qualities, right? It does still involve some kind of order of rank and evaluation. But the Nietzschean argument would be that this is essential to the way we make our world intelligible in light of meaningful goals and aspirations for our lives. And that if we take that away, what also falls apart is our ability to treat other people as equals, our ability to recognize others as having an equal dignity rather than, say, a threat to my very limited power, which then in turn leads me to seek domination as my only solution to kind of resolve this internal instability, right? So I would argue that one reason for the left to accept this kind of perfectionist language is that it opens a kind of aesthetic dimension of artistic and cultural criticism that is aspirational in character, and that I think still needs to be explored in ways that may challenge the narrative language we're used to employing in the left, but still needs to be explored as a condition of possibility, not for an aristocratic society, but precisely for an egalitarian, precisely one in which people are equally able to realize human potentiality in ways that create new and greater cultural forms, whatever those might be, right? And that we shouldn't shy away from that idea that doing so in some ways takes out a great deal of what's meaningful about life, and also makes it difficult for us to make others and the world intelligible in terms of our moral ends. And the result is a deepening of cruelty, a deepening of hatred, a general feeling of malaise and lack of intelligibility that is ultimately going to degrade the moral conditions of society. I think that would be the kind of challenge that Nietzsche poses when he talks about cultural decadence, that we need to recognize the ways in which perfectionist claims of cultural greatness, for example, may have an essential function to play in not opposed to our moral language, but precisely sustaining our ability to imagine productively moral relationships with others.
Yeah, that was very, very eloquently put. I think, we could obviously go on for this for far longer. I find this a fascinating topic, but we both have limited time. And my last, just final question is Devin, is there a particular book of Nietzsche that you would recommend for those who have not immersed themselves in Nietzsche's work yet? Like, which particular book of his would you recommend? Because people have all sort of different answers with regard to this.
Yeah, I'm going to recommend two. And neither of them books, but smaller texts, actually. The first I would recommend people start with is Schopenhauer's Educator, which is where I think this kind of idea of cultural moral perfectionism comes through most clearly. And an interesting biographical note is that when Nietzsche met Lou Salome, who was his one, the one really fierce love of his life, he gave her a copy of Schopenhauer's Educator as what he called the best expression of his philosophy at the time. So it's a moving essay that really is inspired, I think, in many ways by Emerson, that particularly for American readers is often something I think they're receptive to. But I think when it comes to a broader kind of summary of Nietzsche's philosophy, I like the fifth and final book of The Gay Science. This is something that he appends later to the first 4 volumes of the book. But to me, represents maybe the best overview of the kind of core themes of Nietzsche's later thought, and in ways that also help connect to other parts of his work. I think both in ways that are sufficiently contained in The Gay Science that it gives a summary of its own, but also can kind of pique interest in kind of where to go next in Nietzsche. So that's the book that I always go back to.
Part 5 of The Gay Science.
Yeah, book 5, Fearless Ones. As I know, it was appended later on. I want to say in 1886, but I could be misplacing that. That's the year he wrote prefaces for many of his older books. And I think that is, particularly when it comes to questions of the death of God, meaninglessness and disenchantment, the revaluation of values, reflection on the eternal return, I think that is probably the place that gets the best overall summary of Nietzsche's mature work and mature thought.
Yeah, look, this is excellent. I think this will be very helpful. Devin, is there anything would you like to plug before I let you go?
Well, I appreciate you having me on, Tony. I guess if I'm plugging anything, if anybody is interested in hearing more about what I have to say about Nietzsche, I do have an active Substack where I am working through my current book on Nietzsche and madness, exploring some of the themes that we talked about today, but also exploring some more psychological and therapeutic themes. And there will also be a book with 0 books, provisionally entitled One or Several Nietzsches that should be coming out, hopefully 2025. Some guys from the Acid Horizon pod. So be on the lookout for that in a couple of years.
Cool. Yeah. If you guys enjoyed this pod, please give it a 5-star rating. It really helps people discover the podcast, and send it to your friends. We really benefit from word of mouth. And if you like to hear extra content, be sure to become a patron. Helps support the show, keeps us going, and the main channel.
All right. Thanks for having me on.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimists, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens, and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.